welcome. This is the lecture on Chapter 4, Nonverbal Communication. Now, nonverbal communication is very simply everything else other than the words we say when we communicate. It's the way our hands move, the tone of our voice, the pace that we talk at, the clothes we're wearing, the room we're in. Basically, everything else rounds out to be nonverbal communication. And yeah, everything other than the use of language, that equates to nonverbal communication. All right, one of the main aspects of nonverbal communication is kinesics. And there are 5 main categories within that, but kinesthetics itself is the study of face and body movements during a conversation. So the 5 different aspects of this, the first is emblems. So emblems are used to represent feelings and ideas that aren't normally expressed verbally. And the second one is illustrators. And they are used to emphasize ideas and words that are used in verbal communication. And then we have affect displays, which use nonverbal face and body movements, and they're used to express emotion. Then we have regulators, and regulators are a way for us to tell the other person in the conversation how we'd like them to behave. An example of this is in the Midwest. You might notice when someone's ready to end a conversation, they'll say, "Welp," and they'll use both hands to slap their thighs, and they may even stand up and like they're getting ready to leave. And that's them signaling to the other person that they're ready for this conversation to end. And finally, we have adapters. Now, adapters are when you're using some kind of behavior to satisfy yourself. Now, a good example of this is with public speaking, when someone has some kind of behavior they use when they're subconsciously they use when they're nervous. So a nervous gesture like this might be shifting foot to foot, moving a little bit, or doing something with their hands. Anyway, something of that nature is an adapter. Now, there are some real misconceptions when it comes to nonverbal communication. And I know there's a video included in the section below this that just illustrates some more about some of the misconceptions. But one of the misconceptions is that 93% of meaning comes from nonverbal communication. And that's a bit misconstrued because it's based on this old study that they added up all of the other parts other than the words, and it all came together to 93%. But that wasn't a very accurate study because of a number of different factors, one of which being they just focused on like single emotional words, and that kind of misconstrued, or those results aren't as accurate as they should be. And some other things that are misconceptions about nonverbal communication is that some things are constant across everyone. That doesn't matter where you're from, who you are, where you grew up, that some of the meanings are universal. But that isn't exactly true either, because just think about a smile. There are a number of reasons why you could smile. And they don't all have the same meaning. One could be as simple as you're happy. Another one is you're satisfied with the work you just did and you're relieved. And there's all sorts of other variations that, while similar, they don't give us the same meaning. It's not a hard rule that this is what this means. And then another misconception is about lying and deception. And that is the misconception about that is that you can always tell when someone's lying. Once you know body language, nonverbal communication, like you can nail down when someone's lying every time. But that isn't really the case. When we're talking about nonverbal communication and establishing if someone's lying or not, a lot of times we're looking for a baseline of their normal behaviors when they're not under stress, when they're not doing these things. And we kind of need to have a firm understanding of that to then compare against them when they are telling an untruth, when they are lying. And then it's kind of comparing and contrasting those. But because we're not machines, the levels of those vary pretty heavily. And so it's impossible to always detect when someone's lying. And then the last misconception I wanted to talk about is that you can read people by their nonverbals. And that isn't really true because everyone has a different variation of the way they react to certain things. They have different reactions, different behaviors, different ways of expressing those same feelings, emotions that are, while they're very similar, they are variations. And so it doesn't work out on a one-to-one basis, but also we can't really read someone non-verbally because a lot of the behaviors and things we do non-verbally don't really translate into a verbal language. Like an example is if you are waving at someone, but you're kind of cautious about it, you have to go through a lot to sort of get across the idea that they're doing a little like half, like sort of hesitant wave. Whereas if you just saw the person, like you might just draw that conclusion. So we can't really read people's nonverbals as well as we might think. So, all right, moving on. Now, there are a number of similarities to verbal communication when we talk about nonverbals, but nonverbal communication is a really broad category when compared to verbal communication. Verbal communication is just the words that come out of your mouth. But nonverbal communication is the tone of your voice, the pacing, your eye movements, your facial gestures, your movements of your body, your hand movements, your posture, the clothes you wear, how close you're standing to them, everything about the situation is nonverbal communication. However, there are some things that line up well between nonverbal communication and verbal communication, and those deal with sharing ideas. So some of the things we do with nonverbal communication lines up well with verbal communication in the symbolic gestures and the symbolism of some of the things we do. Also, a lot of times with our gestures, we are intentionally sending a message. When we're adding feelings, we're adding meaning to what we're doing. And that's the same as when we're communicating verbally. We're adding meaning to what we're sending. And just like with verbal communication, we're also assigning meaning to the messages, the symbols that we're receiving. All right, let's move on. All right, let's talk about another aspect of nonverbal communication, and that are the elements of communication that are static and dynamic. So those refer to the things that are constant during a conversation, like the clothes you're wearing, the place you're having the conversation. But there are other things that are constantly changing during a conversation, and those are the dynamic things, like your eye movements, the tone of your voice, the pacing, the things that change throughout the conversation, that are subtle, that are easy to change. Those will be the things that we refer to as dynamic. Let's talk about cultural guidelines, what is appropriate and what isn't. So there are a number of things across different cultures that may be appropriate there, but they aren't appropriate here, or vice versa. And one of those is the cultural greeting of kissing the other person on the cheek when you greet them. Now, in the United States, that's not such a normal gesture. I mean, it happens sometimes, but it's not as common. Another cultural gesture that's uncommon in the United States that is more common in places like Japan is bowing when you're greeting someone to show respect. And nonverbal communication is multifaceted, and that means a couple of different things. Our messages aren't as clearly defined because with nonverbal communication, there are a number of different streams of messages coming in at the same time. There's our face movements, our body movements, and the tone of our voice, and those other things, but they aren't always as clear and defined as sometimes our verbal communication. And our nonverbal communication is often a bit outside of our control, especially our candid reactions. We have trouble controlling those as compared to our planned reactions when we intentionally behave a certain way. And like I said before, we are sending and receiving multiple messages at the same time. And that's called a multi-channel. Is that we are sending and receiving multiple messages through different channels. Communication, we don't stay in one lane with only verbal communication or only nonverbal communication. They're used together, and what this does is this helps us create more precise messages. It helps us give more meaning than we'd be able to give without language or with only language, but together. And that creates this deeper meaning. But one of the things that we'll talk about when it comes to combining verbal and nonverbal communication is oftentimes, especially when there's deception involved, there is a contradiction between what is said in words and what a person displays in their nonverbal communication. An example of this isn't so much about deception as it is about hesitance. So if we were to ask someone about how they did on a test, they might use all positive language that they think it did great. All the answers seem like things they'd studied, like they knew everything that was on the exam. But you might notice that as they're saying that they think they did really well, they're subtly shaking their head side to side, that they're shifting, looking a little uncomfortable. And that might mean that while they are saying that they thought it went all well, they're not as confident. They don't really fully believe that those subtle behaviors are showing a contradiction in their belief that they did well on the exam. All right, next. When we start an interaction, it often starts with nonverbals before any language becomes involved. An example of this is, how do you start a conversation? I mean, first, you need to approach someone. You just don't magically end up in front of someone. There's an approach. There's a lead up to a conversation. I once saw a video of an over-exaggerated start to a conversation, and it was someone who was essentially doing door-to-door sales. And they were walking on one side of the street, and they saw someone coming the other way on the opposite side of this residential street. And so they made it extremely clear that they wanted to start a conversation with the person walking the other way. And you could tell because they started like they wanted to shake that person's hand. From the second they left the sidewalk on one side of the street, they marched with their arm extended, like an arrow pointing right to that person, their arms stretched out the whole way, ready to shake their hand. Now, normally, we don't start interactions in such an obvious and kind of clumsy way. It's often more subtle, is the way we start a conversation. And another thing we do with nonverbals is we signal the end of a conversation. Now, how do we signal that? If we're in the Midwest, like I might have mentioned earlier, that you might notice at the end of a conversation when someone's signaling they're ready to be done, they'll use both hands and slap their thighs and say, "Welp," as they stand up and start moving towards the door. And that's a way that they use nonverbals to kind of signal that they're ready for this conversation to be done. All right, let's move on. Nonverbals, we often use them to convey more emotional meaning about ourselves, about how we feel about the situation. Do we feel uncomfortable about the situation? Are we nervous about where we're at? And we also use it to convey information about the others we're talking to, or how we feel about them. An example of this is I saw a conversation with two students at the college, and one had their shoulders and they were facing directly at one person, but the person he was talking to, you could tell he was trying to get away from the conversation because he was turned slightly to the side, like he was looking where he wanted to go, like he wanted to kind of turn away from this conversation. He was angled away, and every so often you could see him like turn and look and turn and look, like he was looking for a way out of the conversation. So you could tell that he wasn't as involved with the conversation as the person who was looking directly at him and squared up facing him. Environment often heavily impacts the way we communicate, especially with our nonverbals. Think of how you might interact with people if you were, say, presenting in a boardroom to the board of directors of a large company. It might be a very formal situation where you're getting across this information, and you're likely to keep a professional distance from them. And in the way you behave. But imagine hanging out in your friend's basement. It's going to be very casual, going to be very familiar, and the way you're going to behave is going to change significantly in that environment. Some other things that change with the environment is how far apart you will be when you communicate with someone. In some situations, it's normal to stand a couple feet away. In others, you're going to be so close you're almost touching. And some of those, it'll depend on the environment you're in as to how you decide what's appropriate. Now, the word for how we describe how far away we are when we're communicating is proxemics, and that is the study of space and distance being involved with communication. Let's talk about personal space. Personal space is the area immediately around us, and we might refer to this space around us as the body buffer zone, a kind of imaginary area around us that you almost think of as part of yourself. Like if someone comes within this range, you're going to feel a bit uncomfortable. Another thing we talk about with personal space is the idea that we kind of lay claim to areas or places or things, and we get a little defensive when someone invades that space. Say you have your one spot you sit in class every day. You might feel a little bothered if one day someone decides to take your seat, because now you've started to think about it as your seat, not just a seat in the class, but your seat. And the word for that is territoriality. Ooh, that's quite the mouthful. But that's the idea that we establish and maintain a space and we claim it for our own personal use. This is the final section of this chapter, and it's going to talk about the various different types of nonverbal communication. First of all, let's talk about facial expressions. There are a number of different facial expressions that are involved, and we could go over each individual muscles, and when this tenses up, it might mean this, and there's a whole system for labeling and categorizing different facial movements. But for the purpose of this class, we're going to talk about it is contained within 4 categories. And these are de-intensification, and that's using facial expressions to lessen the emotional intensity of something. Another one is over-intensification, which is essentially the opposite. Instead of lessening the impact, we want more of an emotional display, more of an emotional impact. And then we have neutralization, a form of facial expression which displays emotions that are non-existent or just like quickly wipes them out right after. And then masking is a different form where instead of relating directly to what is being discussed or the emotions being felt, you display something different. You hide your true emotions or show the opposite of what you're feeling. Physical appearance, that is really pretty self-explanatory. It's how you look, how you dress. And artifacts, that's talking about your clothing, if you're wearing glasses, if you are wearing a backpack, if you're dressed in a suit. Those are all things that we're talking about when it comes to your physical appearance, your hairstyle, things like that. Eye contact. When we talk about eye contact, we're going to talk about 3 main terms. We're going to talk about your gaze, which is where you are looking. Are you looking at the person in the face? Are you looking over their shoulder? Are you looking somewhere else? Are you looking at your shoes? The next is going to be eye movements. Are you frequently looking away? I mean, staring directly at someone all the time, that's kind of might be a show of hostility, but some eye movement is normal. No eye movement is kind of abnormal, so you're looking for that mid-range for normal eye movement. Now, eye contact would be as if you lock eyes and have a little staring contest with them. Some eye contact is normal. Again, excessive eye contact feels uncomfortable, and no eye contact also feels a bit uncomfortable, unless it's a cultural situation where it's inappropriate to look someone in the eyes. Chronomics are the study of and use and evaluation of time with interactions. Is it a long, drawn-out interaction, or was it a quick 5-10 second conversation like interaction? Haptics are the final thing we're going to talk about in this section. Haptics is the study of nonverbal behaviors that involve touching and feeling. That's what we're talking about when it comes to haptics. In conclusion, nonverbal communication covers a wide spectrum of things. Unlike verbal communication, which is focused on language and encoding messages in that language, Nonverbal communication is focused on a broad spectrum of essentially everything else when we're communicating, from the pitch, the tone of voice, how it's said, what we're wearing, where we're at, how we're behaving. All of those things come together to help us form what we might think of as nonverbal communication. I look forward to seeing you in the next one.